So a food chain is a simple explanation for the flow of energy in an ecosystem. So the flow of energy is always going to start with the producer, an autotroph, and then move to the heterotrophs and the decomposers. So the reason why a food chain is considered simple is because it does not show the natural flow of energy in an ecosystem. Because usually, like, for example, in this food chain, you have grass. Well, grass isn't normally the only thing that gets eaten by a grasshopper. And also, lots of other things eat grass other than the grasshopper. So, a food web is better because it's going to show everything that eats the grass and everything the grasshopper eats, and so on and so forth. Most organisms, if they only eat one food, that's not a very good adaptation. They're going to have to adapt to multiple food sources. So anyway, food chains are simple. And so the whole reason we use a food chain or a food web is to show the flow of energy. Okay, so that's the big idea here. And that flow of energy is demonstrated in the arrows in both the food chain and a food web. Okay, so your energy comes from the sun. Okay, so energy goes from the sun to the grass, then the grass to the grasshopper, and then the snake gets energy from the grasshopper, and then the hawk gets energy from the snake, and then your decomposer fungi gets energy from the hawk, and really probably everything else, to be honest. As everything dies, it gets decomposed. So here would be a food web. So as you can see, this is a little more accurate of what would happen in an ecosystem. So notice we have just in general plants along the bottom. So those would be our producers, and that's what your food chain and food web is always going to start with an autotroph, with a producer. And then we have all of our herbivores, and then you get into some omnivores, or even your primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers. So we're going to take a few minutes to analyze this food web. So first off, your only producer here is plants. Your only autotroph is plants. So that's going to be where your food web would start. Okay, so then rabbits. Oops, sorry, I thought I was on the pen. So rabbits, squirrels, mice, seed-eating birds, and herbivorous insects are all going to feed on producers. So all the things in pink are going to be primary consumers because they eat the producer. Okay, now let's take a look at some secondaries. So secondary consumer eats the primary. So the fox is going to be considered secondary because it eats rabbits, squirrels, mice, the seed-eating birds. Okay, so and because of that, it will be considered secondary. Another thing that will be secondary is predaceous insects because it eats herbivorous insects. Also spiders, also insectivorous birds. Maybe it'll help if I draw the lines for you. Snakes can be secondary. Did I get them all? Okay, hawks and owls also can be secondary because the bird here. Okay. So I'll just draw the lines for yellow so you can see that those are your secondary things. Okay, so secondary. Now, usually if you have a question about these things, it'll ask you specific questions. Like, if a fox eats mice, what kind of consumer is it? Or if a snake eats a toad, what kind of consumer is it? Or something along those lines. Or what will happen to toads if snakes die out? Something along those lines. Okay, so your tertiary consumers we'll do in green. Okay, so if we go, let's see, all right, so toads is definitely tertiary because eat first, second, third. Okay, first, second, third, so insectivorous. There's another one for that one. Let's see, so it can go first, second, third. So snakes would be first, second, third. Hawks and owls would be first, second, third. Foxes would be. Okay, so those are all going to be tertiary consumers. And really, to be honest, your spider. Okay, so if you went here, then here, then here, then your predaceous insect could be tertiary, and then you could go here, then here, then here. So your spider could also be tertiary. So you have lots of tertiary consumers here. Pretty much every consumer is that's not the herbivorous insects in this particular food web is going to be tertiary. And then the last one we have, let me get you a different color here. The last one we have is going to be quaternary. Ooh, that looks very similar. Did not mean to make that so similar. Maybe, no, it's similar because it's the same. Quaternary consumer. Okay, so that would be eats fourth. So if we went here, then here, then here, then here, insectivorous could be quaternary. Or here, then here, then here, here, then here, then here. So quaternary, 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 here, 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 quaternary, here, 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 quaternary. Okay, so I've circled your quaternaries. So those are going to be your top consumers. So anyway, I hope this kind of helps you understand food webs a little bit. Some questions you might see on a food web would be, what happens if rainfall is reduced? Well, if rainfall is reduced, then plants will be reduced and everything in the food web will be reduced. So whatever you do to the producer, if you reduce the producer or increase the producer, that's going to either increase or decrease everything in the food web. So your producers, because they start the food web, whatever happens to them happens to everything in the food web. So it's a direct relationship. Now, sometimes you'll see an indirect relationship or inverse relationship depending on what you're looking at. So, for example, if foxes all die out, then you're going to have an increase in rabbits and squirrels and mice and seed-eating birds and insectivorous birds. But if insectivorous birds die out, then you're going to have a increase in spiders, but a decrease in snakes, and a decrease in hawks and owls, and decrease in foxes. But then you'd have an increase in the things that it eats: spiders, herbivorous insects, predaceous insects. So it just depends. You have to look at it and see. Okay, so this is kind of a little bit of what I was just talking about. So food webs are dependent upon each other. So all the organisms in the food web are dependent upon each other. So if the rabbit, what would happen to rabbits if grass was wiped out? Well, you're going to have a decrease in rabbits. If rabbits and mice decline, then the owls and the foxes will also decline because that's their food source. If the rainfall increases, then everything in the food web would increase. If rabbits increase, then their predators, owls, will also increase. So if you have more producers, then everything will increase, because that's what I was talking about a few minutes ago. Your top consumers, your apex predators, are going to be considered the animal at the end of the food chain or web, and it has no predators, so that's usually a carnivore. So we saw the foxes and the owls, the hawks, the snakes. I believe the snake was eaten by the hawk. Hang on, let me go back and check. No, it wasn't in this particular food web. Maybe it was too big of a snake or something. But anyway, so your top consumer, basically nothing is going to eat it. So that's also called the apex predator. So the order that your food chain or food web will always go in is producer, because they make their own food, so that starts it. And then you have your primary consumer. It's the first thing that eats. Secondary consumer eats the primary, so it eats second. Tertiary eats third, so it eats the secondary consumer. And quaternary consumer eats fourth in the food web, and it eats the tertiary. So that brings us to the 3 ecological pyramids. So the first one really is basically like putting a food chain into a pyramid shape. So it's called the pyramid of energy. So what it's going to do is it's going to show you how energy is transferred through each trophic level in a food chain or food web. So, if you look at the pyramid, you'll notice that the bottom level is producers. That would be the first thing you'd see in a food chain. And then you have the thing that eats the producers, the primary consumer. Then the thing that eats the primary consumer, which is the secondary consumer, and so on and so forth. So each trophic level is those things we've been learning. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and then quaternary consumer. So if I were you, I would write that next to trophic level, next to the definition. So those are your trophic levels. Okay, so each trophic level indicates how many times energy has been transferred. So the most energy is going to come from the sun into the producer. And then each time you're losing 90% of energy as heat. This is one way that our bodies stay warm, is because we're losing energy as heat. And once that energy goes to heat, if you recall, it can't be converted back. But anyway, so you only get 10% of the energy from the food that you consume. So in an energy pyramid, you're looking at how energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. And the big thing you need to know here is the percentage, that 10%. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture in just a second, and you're more likely to see a picture like this and have to calculate. And since it's 10%, all you do is move the decimal. But anyway, so producers, like I said, are going to have the most energy, and then whatever's at the top of the energy pyramid, the top consumer, or sometimes that's the decomposer, they're going to have the least amount of energy from the original energy that came from the sun. And again, remember, 90% of that energy is lost as heat. Only 10% goes to each level. So this is the picture I was talking about. So if you look up here, you have your primary producers, and they're just saying, sometimes you see it's called primary. It's not that big of a deal. It's still just the producer. Okay, and then you have primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. That should look like a food chain. So if you look here, they've pretty much put the food chain here to the side. And then, so what's going to happen is the phytoplankton is going to get 10% from the sun. 10% of 10% is how much? 1%, because you just move the decimal place over. Okay, and then 10% of 1% is going to be 0.1%. So it's going to get smaller and smaller, and then 10% of 0.1 is 0.01%. I don't know if y'all can see that very good. I'm trying to make it look better. So, really all you have to do is just move the decimal place to the left each time. And then over here at this one, let me move that one where you can see it. So here you have producers. So again, 10% from the sun. And then when we go up, 1%, 0.1, 0.01. So the pyramid of biomass. So you know what mass is. It's how many grams or what is in something, whatever it may be, whatever you're talking about. So we're talking about organisms here. So biomass is the mass in the living organisms at that particular trophic level. So again, we're still dealing with those trophic levels. So it's going to show the amount of living material for each trophic level. The producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and so on. And again, it's going to decrease as you move up. So again, producers are going to have the highest biomass. Your top consumers are going to have the lowest biomass. So if you recall, we take mass in grams. So it's usually kilograms. So if you see a pyramid with grams in it, then that's going to be biomass. And let's look at the picture on that. Do you notice anything similar with this picture? So my producers, I have 1,000 kilograms. My primary consumers, I have 100. Primary carnivores, which is my secondary consumers, 10. And then my top carnivore, which is my tertiary consumers, 1. Again, 10%. So with the pyramid of both biomass and energy, you're going to see that you're only getting 10% for each trophic level. So you would calculate that the same way by moving the decimal place over. And this one down here, sorry. So this one down here, decomposers sometimes are an outlier because decomposers decompose everything in the whole food chain or food web. So sometimes they won't have that typical pyramidal shape. So both pyramid of biomass and energy are going to have usually a typical pyramidal shape. So like here, you're going to have that pyramid shape, but then sometimes you might see decomposers as an outlier because there's usually a lot more of those because they got to decompose everything. So pyramid of numbers is where it doesn't really look like a pyramid sometimes. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Pyramid of numbers is just what it sounds like. It shows the number of individual organisms at each level. So maybe you have 235 trees and 462 frogs. So it's showing you the number of organisms at that particular level, the producers, the consumers, and so on and so forth. And so it's not going to be in grams, and it's not going to be in energy. It's going to be just plain numbers. So like I said, it might not look like a pyramid, and this does not go by that 10% rule that the other two do go by. So here's two different pyramids of numbers. So this top one does look a little closer towards a regular pyramid, but the bottom one does not. And let's talk about that difference. So the top one is very vague. It just says producers. Okay, so producers in an ecosystem is usually not just one thing. It could be grass, it could be trees, it could be a rose bush, it could be lots of different producers or plants. But then if you look at a more focused ecosystem, they might be focusing on a particular producer. So in this one, it does not look like a typical pyramid. Notice that you don't have as vague. It doesn't just say producers, carnivores, herbivores, and so on. This one just says willow tree. Willow tree is pretty big considering, if you're comparing it to the size of another plant. You compare a willow tree to one grass or one small plant, small flower. Trees are going to usually support a lot of organisms. So you don't have to have as many trees to support the same amount of organisms. So that's why you might see in the pyramid of numbers the producers not necessarily having the most because some of the producers get pretty big. And then if you look here, your invertebrates, you have a lot of those. Invertebrates are usually going to be insects. Insects, if you recall from when we talked about animals, I told y'all they were the most numerous organisms in all of the different phyla of animals because there's just a lot of bugs everywhere. So that brings us to biogeochemical cycles. So if you break that word down, y'all should already remember, and I know you know, that bio is life. Geo refers to the earth. And then, of course, chemicals. We know what chemicals are. So basically what biogeochemical cycles are is that we're talking about the main atoms that make up living things. But they don't just come from living things. They also are cycled throughout the earth. Okay, so y'all know that oxygen and nitrogen, carbon dioxide, those things are in the atmosphere. Well, the atmosphere is not alive. So the biogeochemical cycles are going to look at those things that make up most of our cells and how they are cycled between the living and non-living parts of the ecosystem. So that would be biotic, living, and then abiotic, non-living parts of the ecosystem. So for example, oxygen is cycled from the atmosphere, which is non-living, into your body, which you are living. So We're going to go a lot more in depth, of course, than that. So remember, 96% of your body is made up of CHON, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. But you do have P. Remember we talked about CHOMP, okay, that phosphorus. That phosphorus is located in your nucleic acids, also in ATP. So that's there too. So we are going to talk about the phosphorus cycle as well. Anyway, energy only goes one way. We talked about that. Once it's lost its heat, it's gone. But these chemicals, these atoms, they can be recycled and reused. So that's why it's called a cycle. So the water cycle will start y'all off easy. Most of y'all have learned the water cycle before. You might see a new word here, but most of it should be very familiar to you. So again, it's looking how water moves from the atmosphere to the ground to the earth. So, and then back into the atmosphere again. When it goes to the ground, of course, it may or may not go into a living organism. So, water, remember, is H2O. So there's the H and the O we were talking about. So precipitation is basically water coming down. Anyway from water leaving the atmosphere coming down to the ground. So that could be rain, snow, sleet, ice, hail, any kind of water coming down from the atmosphere. Evaporation is the opposite. Water going up. Okay, so water going from a mud puddle, lake, river, stream, ocean, any kind of other body of water, it is evaporated and goes up into the atmosphere. And that usually does, need some heat for that to occur. And of course it's called water vapor, and I think y'all probably already know that. But what you might not know is something called transpiration. Okay, so that's probably a new term for you. So transpiration is evaporation from a plant. That's all it is. So water can be evaporated from the plants to go into the atmosphere. If you've ever seen plants get shriveled up in the sun because you don't water them, that's probably why. It's because transpiration occurs. If you recall, we talked about plants having a cuticle. That's that shiny coating on the leaves, and remember we talked about the cuticle being only on the top part where the sun shines. It's usually not on the bottom part of the leaves, and that cuticle, if you remember, is a lipid, a fatty layer, and it prevents the plant from losing water because the water won't go through that fat. So there's just, remember that from biomolecules. So anyway, water goes to the ground, it rains. One or two things happens. It either sinks into the ground, and then it's called groundwater, or it becomes runoff, and eventually that runoff will flow into a ditch, and then a creek, a stream, a river, a lake, a pond. It'll find a body of water. Anyway, so that's the two places it'll go to, and of course it could go into a plant or an organism. And then the other thing is condensation. So once the water evaporates and goes into the air, into the atmosphere, sometimes it can stay up there a while. And so what happens is it condenses. The water condenses and forms clouds. So condensation is how you get clouds. Once the clouds get too heavy and have too much water, then that's when precipitation occurs. So with condensation, if y'all remember, one of the properties of waters we talked about in our second unit was that water forms hydrogen bonds. Okay, so that's when you have your Mickey Mouses. Remember, your Mickey Mouse is your H2O. Mickey Mouse's face is negative. His ears are positive. And the positive ears will stick to the negative face of another water. And so that's the hydrogen bond, and that makes water stick to water. So that's why it puddles, and that's also why it condenses into clouds. So here's a picture of the water cycle. So if we start here in the ocean, you can see water is evaporating up from the ocean. Water is also evaporating through transpiration from these trees. Okay, and then it's going to condense into the clouds, and then you'll have some ice and snow here on the mountain, some precipitation here, and so after the water falls, here you have some runoff, and it's going to go into the stream, or it's going to go into the plants, or it's going to go into the groundwater. Okay, so the groundwater, that's where your well is going to get water from. There's actually like underground rivers pretty much that your well taps into. And here's just another picture. It's much simpler, and I think y'all can probably understand what's going on here. Here's your transpiration, condensation, precipitation, and then your evaporation again. Okay, so carbon cycle. So you remember carbon is found in every living thing. We also have carbon in the atmosphere. Most of the time it's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if you recall when we learned about photosynthesis, photosynthesis performs carbon fixation. Okay, which is when you fix the carbon, you fix it by taking inorganic carbon, which is carbon dioxide, and turning it into organic carbon, which is glucose. Your body cannot use carbon dioxide, but you can use glucose. So photosynthesis turns the carbon dioxide into glucose so that you can eat and also utilize the carbon in your cells. So anyway, producers are very important because they change that carbon dioxide into glucose, which is organic. Anyway, so consumers eat the producer. You eat the glucose whenever you eat a plant, and then we go through cellular respiration. So that's kind of the main part of the carbon cycle, is how you have photosynthesis and cell respiration, and photosynthesis makes C6H12O6, and remember that C is the carbon, and then cell respiration makes carbon dioxide. It takes in the C6H12O6 and makes carbon dioxide, and so they cycle that way. Now, something that humans have began doing in the past couple 200 years since the Industrial Revolution is combustion. That has significantly added to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And simultaneously, we're cutting down forests to build, cities and things. And so this has kind of altered the carbon cycle from where it naturally was. So combustion is burning fossil fuels. So when you burn gas or oil or any coal, any of the other fossil fuels, that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It releases a lot more than you typically would have. So if you recall, gas, oil, those things are formed from, if you heard from the dinosaurs, from very, very, very long time ago living things. Well, those living things had carbon in them. So when you burn the fossil fuels, you're releasing that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's why they say it's bad for the atmosphere. So again, cellular respiration changes your organic compounds back into inorganic carbon dioxide when you breathe it out. Decomposers also go through cell respiration. So they're going to break down and release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So again, when an organism dies, the carbon becomes trapped, and eventually it decomposes. That organism decomposes to become a fossil fuel. And then when that fossil fuel is burned, that burns the carbon into carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then again, plants are going to absorb it and start the whole thing over again. So this is a picture of the carbon cycle. It actually also has a little bit of the oxygen cycle on it too, because those two are very closely related. So here we're going to look at carbon. So here's your carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it's being produced by fossil fuel emissions, also by people, organisms. And if you look here, livestock, here's some cows producing methane. And yeah, there's a bunch of it. Okay, so then you have your carbon dioxide from the atmosphere going into the plant to go through photosynthesis. See, it's going into the plant to go through photosynthesis. And here is the decomposition of an old tree, where the carbon's going to go into it. And here's the carbon going in through photosynthesis. Okay, and then if you look at oxygen, and y'all know that plants make oxygen and it goes into the atmosphere, and then the people will take in the oxygen, or other animals will take in the oxygen. So that brings us to oxygen cycle. We kind of just looked at it. So again, oxygen and carbon cycles are very closely related. They are going to use photosynthesis and cell respiration. So in photosynthesis, water is split, okay? And when water is split, the H, here I'm just going to write the equation for y'all so y'all can remember. Okay, so remember in photosynthesis, plants take in water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight, and they make oxygen and glucose. So if you recall, in the light reaction of photosynthesis, water and light are used, and that water, the oxygen and hydrogen are split. And so the hydrogen goes into the glucose here, but the oxygen is going to be by itself and be released into the atmosphere. So your hydrogen, carbon, and carbon dioxide is going to combine to make your glucose, and then that oxygen that was on the water is going to be split and go into the atmosphere. And then in cell respiration, remember, you take in that glucose and that oxygen that was made by the plant, and then you release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and then water and ATP. Okay, our cells use the water and ATP. So, oxygen is taken in by organisms during cell respiration and is converted into the carbon dioxide. And then in photosynthesis, oxygen is made from the water and the carbon dioxide. Ozone is O3, so we've always talked about O2. We talk about O2 because that's what photosynthesis and cell respiration uses. Your body cannot process O3. O3 is called ozone. It's harmful to breathe. It's considered a pollutant at ground level. Ozone is absolutely necessary for the survival of life, though, because it's in the upper parts, the very, very, very top parts of the atmosphere, and it shields us from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation. If we did not have the ozone layer, we would not be alive right now. So this is showing the oxygen cycle, and again, it's just basically photosynthesis, cell respiration. So carbon and oxygen cycles work together through photosynthesis and cell respiration. Cell respiration takes in oxygen, releases carbon dioxide, and then photosynthesis releases oxygen and takes in the carbon dioxide. So then the nitrogen cycle. This is one of the ones that people tend to have trouble with because you may or may not have ever learned this before. So I would spend a good bit of my time studying this. Until you get it. But you will have to discuss this on your test. So nitrogen, again, is going to be found in your nucleic acids. And nitrogen is also found in proteins. So it is used to make amino acids. And we know amino acids are the monomer to build our proteins, like we learned back in our second biomolecules unit. Nitrogen is also in the atmosphere. It actually makes up about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere, and that's going to vary, but it's about that much. But the problem is that most organisms cannot use the atmospheric nitrogen. Okay, so you cannot use that. There's all this nitrogen in the atmosphere. It is not usable to you. Okay, so again, we have to fix it to where organisms can use it. So the nitrogen cycle heavily revolves around bacteria. So you have bacteria that live in the soil, and they live on the nodes of the roots of many types of plant. And so this bacteria can actually take the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, the nitrogen gas, and convert it into ammonia. And so this is called nitrogen fixation. And so this is kind of the first step to getting nitrogen into organisms from the atmosphere. Now, eutrophication, that's a term you need to know, and it does happen from algal bloom. Eutrophication is the depletion of oxygen in the water. And this usually occurs when you have excess nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, and they cause an overgrowth of algae from like an algal bloom. And it eventually causes the oxygen to get used up. When the algae dies and the decomposers are decomposing the algae, they use up all the oxygen because decomposers are consumers, so they go through cellular respiration. And it uses up all the oxygen, depletes the oxygen, and the fish die. So, again, the next step in the nitrogen cycle is going to be called nitrification. Okay, so we made ammonia in nitrogen fixation. We fixed it, took it out of the atmosphere, and made it into a form that some organisms can use. So, more bacteria, different kind of bacteria, change the ammonia into nitrates and nitrites. Okay, so that's NO3 or NO2. This is called nitrification. So nitrification makes nitrites and nitrates, which is the NO2 and NO3. So at that point, plants use the nitrates and nitrites to make plant proteins. So this is where fertilizer comes in. The fertilizer is going to increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil so that plants can make more proteins. Now, then consumers come along and eat the plants. When you eat the plant, you're eating the nitrogen in it. So then you can make nitrogen to make protein in your body, or the raccoon or whatever it is that's eating the plant. So when you put fertilizer in your yard, that puts nitrogen back into the soil, so the bacteria can turn it from ammonia into the nitrates and nitrites. And that includes like fertilizer. There are natural fertilizers like eggshells and banana peels and stuff like that. Because remember, those things are going to have DNA in them because they came from living things. And so that DNA is going to have nitrogen in it and also phosphorus, and it's going to help fertilize the soil. Another thing that contains ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites in the soil is the waste products of animals. So that includes both urine and feces. And so that's why they say manure and poop is going to be fertilizer, because it will have a lot of nitrogen in it. And also when animals die in the woods, that's going to help fertilize things. So anyway, you have decomposers that break down, bacterial decomposers that break down these dead bodies and these waste, and then they turn it into usable forms of nitrogen. Now, there's more bacteria that can change those nitrates and nitrites in the soil back into gas for the atmosphere. And this is called denitrification. Nitrogen in oceans is put back into the atmosphere through denitrification. And we know most of the earth, or more of the earth is ocean. So that's one way we have so much nitrogen in the atmosphere. So make sure you know denitrification, nitrification, and nitrogen fixation. So here is some pictures of the nitrogen cycle. So again, bacteria are very, very important for the nitrogen cycle. They're going to be one of the most important organisms for the nitrogen cycle. So if you look, we have our denitrifying bacteria that are, let me change color. Denitrifying bacteria that's going to convert the nitrogen back into atmospheric nitrogen. And then you're going to fix it. You're going to do nitrogen fixation and fix that nitrogen into a usable form by bacteria. And then that bacteria is going to make it into ammonia, and then it goes into nitrites and nitrates. Okay, and also animal waste, dying plants are going to be converted as well. Any kind of fertilizer you put in. Lightning, you see you have some atmospheric fixation. We have some lightning here because that can play a role in nitrogen fixation sometimes. It's not heavily recognized, but you might see that. And then here's another picture just showing nitrification. And then the nitrogen fixation going from the atmosphere to ammonia. It's not labeled as well. And then ammonia to nitrates, nitrites, and then eventually denitrification going back into the atmosphere. So then you have the phosphorus cycle. So phosphate is going to be found in DNA and RNA. Remember, you have your phosphate group. That's your pool in the pool house garage of the nucleotide. Nucleotides made up the sugar, nitrogen-based phosphate group. And then you have ATP, which has 3 phosphate groups. Phosphates can also be found in the phospholipids of the cell membrane. Okay, so these things, these 4 places I just said, are in every cell in your body. Now, phosphorus does not enter the atmosphere. Okay, so that's one thing that's unique about the phosphorus cycle when compared to the other cycles we just talked about. So it never enters the atmosphere, and it's the only one out of the 5 that we discussed. But it is still cycled between living and non-living parts of the ecosystem. So you'll see rocks come into play in this cycle. Okay, so what happens is the phosphorus is found in rocks, and then it can be dissolved in water. So what happens is rocks are weathered and broken down over time through wind, through water, and different processes. So anyway, once the rock is weathered down, then the phosphorus can be found in the water. So it kind of runs off into the water. And then after it goes in the water, it runs into the soil. So now you have phosphorus in the water and the soil. Okay, and organisms are going to use the soil and water. And so then plants are going to pull it from the soil, pull that phosphorus, that phosphate, into the plant. Remember how I said phosphorus is also used as a fertilizer because plants need it. So plants can convert that phosphate from the soil into an organic version that they can use. And then, of course, when an animal eats a plant, the animal now has phosphorus in it. When those plant and animals die and decompose, it returns back to the soil. So we never actually enter the atmosphere. Now, again, I mentioned eutrophication because excess phosphate and nitrogen can both cause eutrophication or an algal bloom. Algal blooms lead to eutrophication.